Okay, so welcome everybody. I am Abraham Newman, and I am the director of the Mortara Center here at Georgetown University. And one of our primary missions is to promote student and faculty research. And so in this mission, we often hold these kind of book roundtables to talk about new research that's coming out of Georgetown and that hopefully will address kind of real world pressing challenges. And there is no better example of that than Professor Matt Kroenig's current work, The Return of Great Power, Rivalry. Before I forget, I'm going to put the Amazon, can I do it? Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'll ask Jenna, the assistant director, to put it in the chat so everybody can have it. I had it on my Amazon buy now, but it won't let me put it in the chat right now. So the way this event is structured is that we are going to first have kind of a roundtable conversation between Professor Kroenig, Ambassador Dobriansky, and I, and then we'll move to open up the conversation to everybody else. I do want to announce that this event is being recorded, and so if you do not want your image recorded, please turn off your video at this point. We will share this event later on our YouTube channel, and it's a wonderful thing about the asynchronous world is that this content can go into people's courses, and it really, I think it's a very valuable public good. So before we get into the substance of the conversation, I just want to note that the Mortara Center that acknowledges that Georgetown University's success today is in part the product of the work of enslaved labor and enslaved peoples. And if you'd like to learn more about Georgetown's effort to come to terms with its own past, please check out slavery.georgetown.edu. And I'd just like to kind of make the extension to this talk today to say US great power is in part the product of the work and struggles of enslaved labor, and we should always keep that in the back of our heads. So joining the conversation today, we have Professor Matt Kroenig, who is in the Georgetown Government Department, as well as the School of Foreign Service. And also joining us today is Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, a senior fellow in the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard University's JFK Belfer Center. So I will not belabor introductions too long because we don't have that much time. We only have an hour to get into the meat of the topic. So with that, I just want to turn it over to the first question to Professor Kroenig, who I will call Matt because I've known Matt for a long time. So Matt, the core argument of your book is that there is an advantage that democracies have when they're competing against other actors in the international system. And so I was hoping that you could just quickly give us the core nugget. Why is it that democracies have this advantage? And then by extension, I wanted to just press you of, are there spoilers out there in your mind? Things that the global internet or polarization or things that might be getting in the way of this thing that previously offered advantage. So with that, Matt.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Abe. And Abe and I do indeed go back. We were graduate students together doing our PhDs back at Berkeley. So good to be with you here today. And honored to be joined also by Ambassador Dobriansky. And thanks very much to the Mortara Center for hosting the event and for all of you for spending your lunch hour with us. So as Abe said, the book is on democracy versus autocracy and great power competition. And here's what it looks like.
Bye now.
And as many of you might know, the 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States says that the return of great power rivalry is the greatest threat to US national security. And I was motivated to write the book because I think there's something of a conventional wisdom going around in at least Washington that our autocratic competitors, Russia and China, have an advantage in this competition. In the United States, we're polarized, we're gridlocked, we're dysfunctional. And meanwhile, these autocracies can make big, bold decisions, plan for the long term, pull a lever and get things done. And I was skeptical of this argument and so decided to do some research into this. And so the argument of my book is actually that it's the opposite, that democracies like the United States have advantages in long run geopolitical competitions. So let me just say a couple of more words about the book, and then I'll answer Abe's question about are there exceptions or new developments that will undermine that. So the book there are really three parts. First is kind of a theoretical part. Why do we think autocracies might have advantages? Why do we think democracies might have advantages? And so this is kind of an analysis that people have done going all the way back to Aristotle, and I do draw on Machiavelli and Polybius and other kind of classical thinkers. But I draw mostly on recent social science research on democratic advantage. And there has been a lot of recent research suggesting that democracies have advantages when it comes to long run rates of economic growth, that they have advantages when it comes to economic innovation. They have advantages in terms of soft power and building alliances. And they have military advantages. They don't need to worry about repressing their own people. Their leaders have access to more information and debate, which allows them to make better decisions. Their soldiers are able to take more initiative on the battlefield, have higher levels of education. And so really what I do in the book is kind of add that all up and say, well, if democracies are doing well in all of these different economic, diplomatic, and military areas, then is it the case that they're maybe doing better overall? So I consider autocratic advantages as well, but conclude that they're outweighed by their disadvantages. The second part of the book then looks at history, and I go through 2,500 years of history, starting with the Greeks against the Persians, all the way up through the Cold War, and find quite a bit of evidence that democracies do pretty well in these competitions, and for the precise reasons identified in the book. And so look at some cases that people are familiar with, the Peloponnesian War and the Cold War, but also look at some more cases that IR scholars, international relations scholars, often don't study, the Venetian Republic, the Dutch Republic. And I kind of came away from this study with a new appreciation of Western history. And I really kind of see this theme of the passing of the torch of democratic international leadership from Athens to Rome to Venice to Amsterdam to London to its final resting place in Washington, DC today. And then the final part of the book, and maybe the most interesting part of the book, looks at what does this mean for the United States, Russia, and China today, and acknowledge that the United States has its difficulties, but that I think our advantages, our fundamentals are still better than Russia's and China's, and that the United States is still in a position to retain its status as the world's leading state for decades to come. So to Abe's question, will that change? And of course, we can't see the future, and there are many things that are different about great power competition than there were decades ago. But I do think that some of these enduring features remain. So I think the fact that autocracies are more worried about their own populations and the security threat that they pose than the adversary remains. It was an issue for the Spartans. And it's an issue for China today. They spend more on domestic repression than they do on their own military. I think it's the case that autocracies have a hard time building alliances. And we see that again going back to Xerxes and Napoleon and Hitler. And I think we see that today with China, with President Xi's aggressive diplomacy creating a backlash. And also when it comes to economic performance, autocracies often like political control, and they value that more than economic performance. And I think we see that today with President Xi as well, renationalizing parts of the Chinese economy, even though it's undermining Chinese growth. So I think given this analysis and given these enduring features, there's good reason to believe that democracies will continue to have this advantage in the present and the future.
Sorry, it turns out when I unmute myself, I have to ask for permission. I don't know, this current Zoom world, it's so complicated. But thanks, Matt, for that quick rundown. I wanted to turn kind of to take this, what you were just talking about at the very end, about how does this apply to the present, and think a little bit more about how it might factor into the Biden administration's vision of foreign policy. And a core focus, like we would call the dependent variable, is great power competition. So forget about the democracy part. And just, is this really central to what this administration is going to be about? When I think about, one of the biggest challenges that the administration will face will be, a mass extinction event, the future of our planet and whether it can hold. And that really, does it transform what we should be focusing on as the outcome that we're interested in? So let me turn that over first to you, Matt, and then I'd like to get also Ambassador Dobriansky into the conversation as well.
Great. Thanks, Abe. So the Trump administration said that great power competition is the foremost priority of U.S. national security. I think things are more complicated now, as you point out. Biden has said that his top priority is going to be addressing the COVID crisis, about getting the United States economy to recover. He has said that one of his goals is to strengthen the United States at home, fix some of our domestic problems, polarization, racism, other issues. But I think this still will be a major priority for the Biden administration. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was giving an interview just a couple of days ago on MSNBC, and he said that China is the state that poses the greatest threat to the United States and its allies. So seem to be making a distinction between state and non-state threats, because I think you're right, they are focused on also climate change and the pandemic. But when it comes to state challenges, I think China is still the biggest priority. So for people who thought that this was just something that the Trump administration was interested in, I think that's not the case. I think we will have a more competitive approach with Biden. Just two data points on that. Kurt Campbell, who will be the Asia czar at the NSC for Biden, and Eli Ratner, another person who went to graduate school with me and Abe, is likely going to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia at the Pentagon. They wrote a big article a couple of years ago in Foreign Affairs, basically saying this cooperative approach with China over the past couple of decades has failed, and we do need a tougher, more competitive approach. So I think that they will have a more competitive approach. I think there are two differences. I think they're going to be more focused on trying to get allies on the same page, working with European allies and Asian allies to have a cooperative, unified front against China. And then I also think that they do see elements for engagement still, that arms control, climate change, non-proliferation, there are still some areas where we can engage and cooperate with China. So still a priority, maybe not as big of a priority, but certainly at the top of the list.
Great, thanks, Matt. And Ambassador.
All right, well, thank you. First, let me thank you, Professor Newman. Abe, I will call you Abe, but I have to make an amendment to your introduction, and I want to thank the Mortara Center, but the amendment is you introduced me solely as Harvard. I cannot let that stand because my father taught at Georgetown for 3 decades.
Oh.
I am a graduate of the School of Foreign Service, and then I also sit on the advisory board. So I do want to establish my ties to Georgetown.
Go Hilltop.
Indeed, go Hoyas. And then Dr. Kroenig, I do want to congratulate you. I'm going to call you Matt from here on, but I do want to give you a hearty congratulations on the book. It really is an excellent work of scholarship, and your analysis is extremely compelling. And I think that you've well articulated why it is so compelling. One thing that you've done up front is you have put this issue in an historical context, and you've demonstrated why democracy has an advantage and over other political systems, and also just historically over different periods, different times, different circumstances. I also think it's worth thinking back about when Putin appeared in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. And that was a very significant moment because in his speech, he actually talked about how Western values are not their values. And he talked about how Russia would be looking elsewhere and that there was a sphere of influence and Russian values, if you will, that would be competing. We are in a time of competition, and your book really reminds us of that very fact. And it's not only with Putin. It was very striking when Xi Jinping, several years back, appeared on stage at the World Economic Forum and giving arguments about how China is advancing its system and how its system is an attractive system and it's of value to others. So this brings us to a very crucial point, again, in which your book is a reminder. And that is, I would say that there's been a kind of complacency. To me, that's been a bit of the challenge. Over the last years, meaning not even the last years, I'd almost say even maybe about a couple of decades, where we, the United States, the West at large, have been rather complacent in terms of looking at what we're about, in terms of the embracement and the advocacy of our values. And that competition, in fact, had arisen. And that's why I cite the fact of Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference back in 2007, because it was a challenge. And what is it exactly that Russia and China are actually looking at and seeking? They are seeking to minimize, if not literally eradicate, US influence and power abroad. They're also seeking to fragment our strong ties, not just within our alliances, but with our partners. And towards that end, what really makes us stick are these common values, these common objectives, the common political system that we have. And I think that clearly I want to highlight that the book is an important reminder of what we are in fact about, and that we can't be complacent, that there is this battle of ideas, and that we have to be forthright and actually come forward and counter the kind of disinformation that emanates from not only from Beijing, but also from Moscow. I also want to remind, and I'd like to just quote, and I hope you don't mind, Abe, I wanted to address the book first, and then maybe go to the second question, if I may. But on the book, I, of course, am reminded, and I'm sure everyone who's joined today is reminded of what Winston Churchill said, that, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. But you know what? I don't think that everyone would recall some of his other statements. And there were two that I thought were very interesting. And I want to just share it, if I may, and read it. One is a statement that he made in Manchester in 1909. He said, if I had to sum up the immediate future of democratic politics in a single word, I should say insurance. That is the future. Insurance against dangers from abroad, insurance against dangers scarcely less grave, and much more near and constant, which threaten us here at home in our own island. I also like this statement, which he made in the House of Commons in 1944. He said, at the bottom of all the tributes paid to democracy is the little man walking into the little booth with a little pencil, making a little cross on a little bit of paper. No amount of rhetoric or voluminous discussion can possibly diminish the overwhelming importance of that point. I just wanted to remind how it has been important to us throughout history, and that's what you have done so well in documenting. If I may, Abe, just transition, you asked the question about the Biden administration and where great power competition fits in. We know that the Trump administration put forth, as Matt had said, in its national security strategy, which was released in December of 2017, that it's geostrategic competition and strategic competition with China and with Russia, which is an organizing principle of foreign policy. The Biden administration definitely has made it a priority. I think Matt is right in also saying it's in a context. The context, though, I would put it this way. I think they've made alliances in the foreign policy sense an important element of it, and in dealing with a geostrategic competition. Also, China has loomed large, especially. Russia has a seat, but China is definitely looming large in the discourse just in the short time of this administration. Climate change has been established as a priority, and certainly has a COVID. I also think it's noteworthy that if you look at some of the domestic policy appointments, Susan Rice in the Domestic Policy Council, Dennis McDonough over at the Veterans Administration. If you step back and think, these are individuals who their own careers have been in foreign policy, actually. But it underscores the kind of integration that's also existing here, of where foreign policy principles are interrelated with also domestic policy. So I'm definitely in agreement with Matt on this, that the power competition and geostrategic competition really is an important priority for the new administration.
Great. Thank you so much, Paula, for those comments. I wanted to just at this point to ping our viewers. If you have questions, if you put them in the chat, then I will try to filter them to our to the conversation as they come up. So before we go much further, I just wanted to get to this question of um, how vibrant does democracy need to be in order for it to be an effective component of our competitive advantage? And I mean, it won't. Matt, when you were talking about your tour de force of history, you then said, "And here in Washington D.C., it's final resting place." That was, and of course, it's like a slip of words, but you know, it's hard not to engage this conversation without saying that the very thing that you are saying is so vital to our national security is currently under threat by both polarization, by white extremism, by disinformation at home, not just foreign disinformation. So there are all of these different converging threats to our domestic vibrance of our democracy. And I'm wondering if you think that there needs to be kind of a bipartisan foreign policy coalition that says, if we want to win these kind of global debates or challenges, we have to reinvest at home, and how one would do that. Because I think, I long work in the European Studies Center, and we always have this parade of European ambassadors who cite, Western values, rule of law, all these, the core values. But I think for most, 20-something people, it's very difficult to understand why that matters. What does that mean? Rule of law, it almost is numbing. So what would you say to the kind of the blob? What can they do to shake those people and say, if you don't fix this, we're going to be in Russian oligarchy land pretty soon. Anyway, so there's a lot in there. You don't need to answer everything, but just, I open up to you. And then Paula, if you want to add on to that conversation as well.
Yeah, really insightful question, Abe. I think I'll say three things. One, the title of the book, and often the way we talk about domestic regime type, is autocracy versus democracy. But I do think it's better to think about it as a spectrum. And Abe, as you know, political scientists often think about it as a spectrum. We have these polity scores that we use that measure democracy in every country in the world going back to 1815. And it's on a 20-point spectrum from -10 to +10. So I think rather than pure democracy or pure autocracy, there are shades of gray. And so really the argument of the book is that more open, more democratic countries with more checks and balances in the system tend to do better than more autocratic systems. So going back in history, certainly the Dutch Republic wouldn't qualify as a +10 fully consolidated democracy today, but it was more open than its competitors at the time, like the Spanish Empire. And I think that gave it an advantage in certain concrete ways. So first thing I would say is that even though the United States maybe isn't an ideal democracy, I think it's clearly the case that it is more open, it is more democratic, there are more checks on the executive than in Russia or China, and that provides a relative advantage. The second thing I'd say is that I agree we have challenges here at home. You listed some good ones we could add to the list. But I think often some of the things we think of as weaknesses are actually strengths. And Machiavelli wrote about this, in the 1500s about democracies. That we say that democracies are polarized and gridlocked, and they can't get anything done, and there's so much domestic fighting. And Machiavelli said, well, that's actually the strength. We don't make big dumb mistakes because it's hard for the executive to wake up one day and say, I'm going off in this new bold direction. You've got to get your executive branch engaged, the legislature, the public. And so since there are checks in the system, we are slow, polarized, gridlocked, but that also means we don't make the big dumb mistakes. So I think we forget that polarization has an upside as well. I guess final thing is though I do think we have some work to do at home, and I do think that strengthening the United States at home, sharpening our competitive advantage will be important for continued leadership. And so I go through in the book and talk about how our democracy helps us in the economic space, in the diplomatic space, and in the military space. So I think in each of those areas, and I do this a little bit in the book, you can kind of trace what do we need to fix at home to continue our leadership overseas. And I do think that this is a priority of the Biden administration. And I think Ambassador Dobriansky is right. Part of the reason for appointing somebody like Susan Rice to the Domestic Policy Council is because there is a recognition that American leadership begins at home.
If I may jump in, I was worrying if I had to unmute myself, as you said, through central control, but I did not. It surprised me. Let me make a few comments. First, on the issue about us and just democracy and sort of self-correction. You know, I think there are three elements I would add on to what Matt had said. The first is, I look at something that comes up a lot. When you look at where do most people in the world want to come, they want to come to the United States. They want to come to the United States, whether we have flaws or not, because it is a country of opportunity. It's a country where there are laws. It's a country of debate and discussion, and it's also a country of self-correction. And as I said, whether we have flaws, and we have indeed have had flaws over our history, as we know, right up to the present time, that nevertheless, it is a magnet and it is a system. And I know from my time at the State Department that we had to deal with a sizable volume of people who want to come here and to live in the United States. So that's the first. Secondly is a transparency. I do want to say that because I think this is an element that also comes out well in Matt's book. And that is, what are the advantages? There is a transparency, there is a debate and discussion, and it is always a robust one. Does it always come out with the right answers? Maybe not necessarily, but we always are in what we'd call self-correction. And I think that's another strength very much of our own society, is that's a transparency combined with self-correction. And then I just wanted to add something else in the mix that is driven maybe a bit by your question, Abe. And that is, now shifting to Harvard, one of my graduate professors at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, who's well known to many, he wrote a book in which he looked at these political cycles in the United States. And he argued that the United States, if you look at our own history, we go through a kind of political cycle where the American public is either enamored with institutions or it's disillusioned with institutions. And he said, when you come to that point of disillusionment, you basically have what he coined looking at the IVI gap, ideals versus institutions, that the population says, well, our institutions are not serving us, that these ideals are not matched. And I think that, when you look at this past period, I think that going up into the election before last, where people felt disenfranchised. And that was really an issue of 2016 and even before that. I think, it's interesting, his documentation of that. And it's something to be reminded of, that we ourselves go through political evolutions in our own country. I thought he was very right to put that on the table. I wanted to inject that into the discussion. Although this has a focus on foreign policy, it's also one that looks at where we've been, where we are, and where we're going.
Great, thank you. Interestingly enough, we covered two of the questions that have been coming into the chat. One of them was about, is it really democracy, or autocracy, isn't there a gradation? And Matt's response was very much about how there is this variation in them. And then another one was about transparency and the role that transparency plays. The question was, the audience member was a little bit more concerned about the downsides. Like, do democracies sometimes reveal too much? Do they constrain themselves by letting it all, all their cards on the table? So if we might come back to that question a little bit as we move forward. I did want to push the conversation to what we should think about how we should interact with China, because of course that's what everybody has on their mind is, the next great power competition. And I think this comes from my own personal research, where I'm very interested in kind of how globalization interacts with national security issues and how it creates vulnerabilities for actors that engage in global economic networks. But also, there's so many benefits to globalization. And one of my concerns is that when you start talking about great power rivalry, you come up into the kind of the old debate of, are we going to be internationalists, or are we going to be, decoupled? Are we going to have two spheres that kind of, go back to the Cold War? And there's even, like, it's a new Cold War, that kind of stuff. And at least my own perspective is that those are both kind of dead ends. Like that's not where, and that's why the rivalry image can push us into these two outcomes, because there maybe is a third outcome where we're really just trying to prevent vulnerabilities from, we don't want to give up on globalization, or at least that's my point. So then we need to think about, how do we protect ourselves in a world of globalization? And that often means things not about two spheres, but maybe it means having, not just a Chinese provider, but maybe we also want to have a European provider. We want to increase the number of actors in the system that create alternatives. So we're not just locked into a China, a China kind of world on something. So I don't know if this resonates with Matt and Paula, but if you could just kind of speak to, what is your vision of how do we move forward in our policies with China that give us something new, that aren't just maybe just, we're not going to go back to constructive engagement, but I'm really worried about the alternative is new Cold War. Like, is that where we want to be? And maybe you'll say, yes, that's where we want to be. And that would be a great conversation.
Well, I'll go first, Dave, and first to the question on transparency. So in the book, I do look at supposed autocratic advantages as well, and assess those. And so one of the arguments you hear is that international politics is a rough and tumble place. You need to take the gloves off. You need to be able to lie and steal and assassinate and start wars. And autocracies are just better at that. But what I show in the book is that there are downsides to that as well. So some will say, well, in the United States, we're so transparent, we're so open, we have a hard time keeping secrets. Everything goes out in the open, and that's true. There are democratic weaknesses. We are more open to external penetration. But I think that there's a disadvantage for autocracies as well. Yes, Putin and Xi have an easier time saying one thing and doing another. But there are disadvantages to that as well. And this gets to the kind of credible commitments literature and political science that you're familiar with, Abe, is that makes it hard for autocracies to make and keep agreements, because other countries don't trust them. So, we don't trust Putin to abide by ceasefire agreements in Crimea. We don't trust him to abide by arms control agreements. And so that's a pretty big weakness in international politics. When Putin says we have a vaccine that works, everybody's initial response is no, he's probably lying about that. So I think that is one upside of transparency in democracies, is that for the most part, when democratic leaders say things, there's a tendency to believe them. The process that led to those decisions and policies are more transparent, and so we can make those commitments more credibly. On how to deal with China, and maybe let me just congratulate you on your work on weaponized interdependence, which has been getting a lot of attention. That there's a downside to this globalization, and countries can use it as a form of coercive diplomacy. So I think we don't want a new Cold War with China. I think the constructive engagement approach for the past couple of decades has failed. So I think we need to go to more of a balanced approach. And I published a piece on a strategy for China that came out in December, when I argued for kind of a three-pillared approach. First is strengthening ourselves. A lot of competition isn't about, whether it's athletics or anything else, isn't about tearing down the other guy. It's about making yourself stronger. And I think that's part of the strategy for competition. Second, I do think we need a tougher approach to China, to work with our allies to push back on China, impose cost on China where it is threatening us and our allies in the diplomatic, economic, and military space. And then third and finally, I do think we need an engagement track. We do need to try to find constructive areas for cooperation with China. Now, I'm not naive. I don't think that's going to be easy, but I think it is important to try to keep an engagement path open. So as it relates to your question on decoupling, you're right that there is this kind of either or debate. Some people say, well, everybody's getting rich trading with China. We don't want to mess this up. We don't want to mess up globalization. You have other people saying, no, it's too risky. We need to decouple. We need to disentangle our economies. And what I would argue is I think it's a selective decoupling, kind of doing it with a scalpel and not with a machete. In areas where there are sensitive national security concerns, artificial intelligence, 5G and other areas, I do think the United States and its allies need to decouple. I think there are other areas where the concern is just that China is cheating on the international trading system. And there it's not so much decoupling, but it's retaliating, using tariffs and other measures to offset China's unfair trade practices. And then finally, I think there is a third bucket where we can allow basically free trade to continue. If China wants to buy US Treasury bonds, if China wants to buy finished dump trucks, if Americans want to buy inexpensive toys and clothing manufactured in China, I think that's the kind of economic exchange that can continue and maybe serve as something of a ballast in the relationship.
Abe, if I may jump in. So first, I would say I see great power competition as being an important organizing principle of foreign policy today. I do think that that national security strategy that documented it, I think, is quite right in putting that forward and as a new organizing principle. Why? Because it is the reality. Your question was, do you want it to be a new Cold War? The fact is, we could wish, of course, of what we would like things to be. But my response to you, we are in a new Cold War. Do I want to wish that, for that? I don't think anyone would. But I look at what the reality of the situation is. Why? You look at very specifically what China has been doing, not just recently, but over the last several decades. It has invested heavily in its military, in terms of its Navy. It has been a disruptor in terms of the South Pacific and in terms of the islands, as we know, in the South China Seas. We also know that in terms of trade practices, it has also been not only a disruptor, but it hasn't played by the rules in terms of intellectual property rights. I could itemize, the list is very long in that sphere. And then no less politically, we look at, and even the Biden administration just came in and Secretary Blinken cited genocide relevant to the Uyghurs in his recent press conference. So I look at just across the board where we are, what's the reality of the situation. And let me remind that when one of our former colleagues put forth the concept about a decade or so ago of let's let China become a stakeholder. Let's embrace China. Let's engage China as a stakeholder in the international community. Well, there were open arms. And instead of taking that path of becoming a constructive geopolitical stakeholder, instead what happened was China was very specifically on this other path. And this path is what the reality is. And so for that reason, that's why I believe that that's what we should be dealing with. And then we construct our policies therefrom. So in my book, what should we be looking at in terms of our foreign policies? We should be looking at, first and foremost, the protection of our national security interests in every single one of these lanes, in the military context, in the political context, our values, what we're about, no less in terms of the economic context. We should also be looking at forging a strong consensus with our allies. And it's striking to me, by the way, for the first time ever, you have NATO and under Stoltenberg coming forward and making a statement about that NATO is taking a look at what China is doing militarily and how NATO needs to watch that very closely and what will its role be. But secondly, in the economic sphere, I want to end on this note. To me, it's striking here what has gone on. You look back and in terms of China and the manufacturing, not just for the United States, but for many countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, I mean, the list is long. Specifically here, you have what constitutes countries that are looking for other ways of coming together and looking for alternative strategies of taking out sensitive industries out of China. You can't decouple completely, but you can take out sensitive industries. It was very striking during COVID how some of our own American companies could not export critical protective personnel equipment. I mean, that was such a statement. So sensitive industries, electronic industries, what are they doing there? Defense industries, they have to be taken out. Those are the kinds of things that we should be targeting. And I will end on this note. In 2007, Japan put forward what was called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And Japan, Australia, US, and also India were members of it. And they conducted annual military exercises. The purpose was to send a signal that we were united militarily. Well, that entity got blossomed in the last years in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And you have the term is known as Quad Plus, where actually here, New Zealand, Vietnam, by the way, as well as Korea have come into it. And why? Because they see it in their interest that, again, militarily, economically, and politically, the force of numbers of this kind of a coalition, this kind of a partnership in countering what China is doing is absolutely essential. So forgive me for a longer answer here, but I think it's warranted because we could wish for certain things, but the fact is we're confronted with a reality and we need to construct our policies accordingly. That's not to the exclusion of looking for opportunities to bring down the decibel level, but I don't see it at this time.
Great. Well, I think that that's a very forceful case. I, my, I think one of the big struggles is that in the last kind of Cold War-like interaction, we basically had decoupled economies. And so now we have tightly integrated economies. And so I would not question the overarching issue, which I mean, my work is like all about, is that the global economy presents vulnerabilities for the United States. But I do think that there is this road that needs to be navigated between, well, we just are going to confront them on all paths, which I think will certainly end the global economy as we know it, versus one that has, I think Matt used the words a scalpel, not a AR-15 or whatever a howitzer, and that I think is really difficult getting that right, because both sides are listening to the rhetoric and what people are saying, and the there are no rules or norms. It was very clear in the Cold War what the rules and norms were of how we were supposed to interact with each other. Where right now, because we have a different setup where we're very economically integrated, each shot is people are kind of wondering, well, what does that mean? And I just give you this really interesting fact, which is, the Trump administration was one of the most aggressive in terms of financial sanctions against the Chinese regime. They really, took it till 11, as the expression goes. But what we see in the figures is Wall Street hasn't budged. Their investment has been going up, and that kind of like, okay, how do we grapple with that? We're not the old tools of just saying we're in a Cold War. It's not gonna, we're gonna really have to think about how these deep, it's almost like octopus tentacles. How can we unwind them? And I don't have the answer.
May I just jump in if Matt doesn't mind, because Matt is our feature here.
Please, Paula, go ahead.
If I may just, you're right to point out the challenge. And I wasn't suggesting that this is not a diplomatic challenge. And let me add, the Biden administration has come in, and here, what happened last year? You have the EU that signed an investment agreement with China. And that preempts actually the Biden administration's stated policy of wanting to collaborate with, the European community in a united front in dealing with China. It weakens their hand. And it was striking to me, by the way, the Chinese move very rapidly in concluding that agreement. And you might, maybe all of our participants and viewers know that actually they have been working on that agreement for a while, but suddenly it was concluded. It was a preemptive action. And I think it's significant. So I'm not suggesting this is going to be an easy road ahead. It's a challenge, and it's one that has to be navigated. But I would look back at what are our interests, but at the same time, look at how we can change situations like in the trade area and in bringing back some sensitive industries. Actually, whether it's in Mexico, even in Puerto Rico, there were many markets where, by the way, we used to have manufacturing in our neighborhood. And we should be looking at those opportunities. That's going to take time. And I'll mention one last footnote and then over to Matt. It's also striking. I don't know how many know this, but actually Japan and South Korea have been moving very slowly, not just in recent time. They're very sensitive electronic industries, Sony, Samsung. These are all going out and have gone out of China. They now are in India, they're in other locations. And Vietnam is an interesting element in this mix, because Vietnam, although it's small, has been actually opening up its doors and trying to engage and seize this opportunity. So we're in a very interesting period where diplomacy matters and what we look at, but we also have to have leverage. And you can't have leverage if you literally only look at, hey, the positive engagement path initially.
Great. So Matt, we have 10 minutes left, and we do have quite a few questions that have come in on the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer those up, and you don't need to answer all of them. And we don't need to, just, I'm going to offer some, and then you can kind of pick and choose. And Paula also, feel free to jump in. But there are quite a few different types of questions. So one of them is about the kind of how things will emerge, or how things will shift as the US policy maybe creates openings for China, Russia in certain places. So there's one question that is particularly about the Gulf region and kind of Biden's foreign policy actions recently to kind of move back arms sales. And will that create an opportunity for China or Russia as they kind of explore our weaknesses? Another one is more interested in Russian-Chinese interaction with each other. So not so much whether one of those will take advantage of us, but whether they will actually cooperate with each other. Another question is about, there is, I think, a sense within China that time and the quote is from Xi, which is time and momentum are on China's side. And so the question is, are there internal or challenges within China that you see emerging in the coming decade to prevent kind of the linear trend from taking over? There's another question, which is your argument more about military capabilities, that democracies are more able to compete because of military factors or internal factors that promote the military? And is this still relevant today? Is military power the thing that we should be interested in for great power competition? And then there's one final one, which is kind of thinking about how do you square the circle between liberal IR theory, which is often focused on the domestic political, and realist IR theory, which is more focused on this kind of great power competition. And how does your argument fit into that debate? So that was a lot, and we only have 9 more minutes. And because of prior engagements, we were going to have to shut this Zoom down at 1 o'clock. But if you maybe would take a few of those, and Paula, if you want to take some different ones, or you guys can interact with each other on the answers, let me turn it over first to Matt.
And I'd like to suggest, Matt, that you take as many as you want, and I'll squeeze in at the end. So go for it.
Okay, sounds great. Well, great set of questions. I'll address several of them, maybe not all of them. First on the argument, it's about how domestic political institutions affect economic strength, diplomatic strength, and military strength. And so often in the United States, you'll hear people, in fact, Biden yesterday in his speech said that our alliances are our greatest strength. You'll sometimes hear people say, no, it's our innovative economy that's our greatest strength. You'll sometimes hear people at the Pentagon say, no, it's our military power. And so really the argument of this book is that the fundamental cause of power in international politics is domestic political institutions, and that we have an innovative economy, we have this dense network of alliances, and we have a superpower military because of our domestic political system. So it's about all of these elements of power. I would say, however, that I do think military power still matters. We had this nuclear revolution in 1945, and many people think we might be on a new kind of revolution in military affairs. How is artificial intelligence, directed energy, robotics, drones, these other new technologies, are they going to come together and have a kind of new revolution in military affairs? And who figures that out first? Is it the United States? Is it China? Is it someone else? Will it give them a decisive military advantage that we can't quite see right now? And so I do think military power still matters, and that our innovative system does give the United States an edge in these areas, although China is doing some concerning things. So how does this fit into IR theory? It's funny, it's something I've been thinking about, because I would have considered I didn't feel like I fit into any of these camps really neatly, but I would have considered myself more of a realist probably 5 or 10 years ago. But doing this research and doing some research I want to do for my next book, I do think that both are correct, realism and liberalism. And I've been thinking about, what is the synthesis? And in short, so it's something I'm thinking about for my next book. But I think when you have a dominant power or dominant set of powers that are themselves governed by liberal principles at home, then liberal IR theory becomes more important internationally. So it's the power of U.S. and allied leadership is the realist piece, but I think it's our liberal principles that infuses our foreign policy that also matters. So I think it's both the power, but also the open markets, the democracy, and the institutions. On the Russia-China alliance, I go into this in the book. I wrote a spin-off piece in foreign policy that I'll try to put in the chat. I'm less worried about it than many people, because I think autocrats make bad allies. If you look at Russia's own history, Russia has literally almost fought more wars with its allies than with its enemies. It was aligned with the Soviet Union, with Nazi Germany, and fought a war with it. It was aligned with Hungary and Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, fought wars with both of those countries. It was aligned with China in 1969, almost fought a nuclear war. It created this Commonwealth of Independent States after the end of the Cold War, ended up invading 2 of those countries, Georgia and Ukraine. So I think autocracies don't make good allies. It's possible that Russia and China sign a formal alliance tomorrow and then fight a war with each other next week, and they do still see each other as security rivals. Is time on China's side? I would say it's not. 10 years ago, people were saying China's going to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy by 2020. Well, it's 2021. Now people are saying they're going to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy by 2030. I suspect in 2030, we'll say 2040, and that the real answer may be never. China's growth is slowing. A lot of the recent growth has been because of wasteful government infrastructure spending. In fact, and this is the final note I'll make, I published an article in Foreign Policy recently called, I think the title was something like "China is Weak and Dangerous." So a provocative title, but basically that it's weaker than many people think, but it's still dangerous. And it caught the attention of the Chinese propaganda. Global Times, the Chinese propaganda newspaper, published an article about my article and called me a silly and sly Western elite, because it doesn't make sense that China could be both dangerous and weak at the same time. So I think it is weaker than the United States anyway. I think we're in a good position to compete, but that it still poses challenges to us and our allies that we need to take seriously. So I'll stop there and very much look forward to what Paula has to say.
Thanks. I see we have 3 minutes, so I'll take literally 1.5 minutes and give Abe the chance to close. So I'll only take 2. First, in terms of my own view, I think that idealism, I call it idealism, and realism is the best mix of foreign policy. And it varies in terms of what the emphasis is. I think that's been the strength of what we are about. in having that kind of a mix. And then the core question I'd like to address is the one about Russia-China, because it's one that I spend a lot of time on. The term has been used, is it a marriage of convenience? I would say it's not exactly that. I'd say it's a bit more. It's an alignment. It's not an alliance, but an alignment. Here you see that an energy deal was concluded that took some 10 years, even over that. Russia and China concluded an energy deal. Russia is giving China military aid and assistance, very serious. The economic level has also gone up. But let me conclude on this note. When you look at the Arctic, it's interesting. The Russians have built a base in the Arctic in Svalbard, and the Chinese want to be part of the governance structure there. And when you look at what Russian military, particularly the defense minister, is saying, it's very strong language that, no, we don't want China to be part of this governance structure. So you have to be reminded, although this alignment exists and the United States needs to bear watch of it, that at the same time, there are tensions there that exist. Over to you, Abe.
Great. Well, so many interesting conversations that come out of this book. And I just want to once again, go to Amazon, buy now. That's, of course, what we're trying to do is pump the sales. But it's really, it creates a great conversation. I personally think it is an important also, undercurrent to the troubles that are happening in our own country right now, is that if we want to be a global leader, we also have to recommit to these democratic principles, these principles of, an open and fair media, the idea that we should engage in civil conversation with each other, that there needs to be, elections that are acknowledged and upheld because they are the core to having this type of democratic advantage, not just at home, but globally. So I think that if we can all kind of take this as an impetus to go get your voter registration, make sure you're on it, and go, purchase a newspaper. These are the small acts that add up when they aggregate to a society that can be a force for good in the world. So with that, I just want to thank Ambassador Dobriansky again for joining us, and also for Professor Kroenig. It's a wonderful conversation, a wonderful book. And please, if you weren't able to join, or you know somebody that would like to check this conversation out, it will be up on our YouTube channel soon. So thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful day and a great weekend. It looks to be beautiful right now. Go outside if you're in Washington, D.C. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abe.
Thank you.
Thanks all for joining.